The jungle was alive, but that night it held its breath. Rain lashed through the trees, turning dirt into rivers, and thunder rolled like a warning drum across the canopy. Somewhere in the shadows, a cry pierced the storm. It wasn't just any cry. It was the helpless, desperate sound of a newborn. Her newborn. The mother gorilla had felt it coming for days. She had wandered far from the safety of her troop, seeking quiet, seeking safety. But safety, it seemed, had no place in this part of the world anymore. Poachers had been seen near the river. Fires had pushed animals deeper into unstable lands. And now in the middle of the storm, she was alone, terrifyingly alone, with a baby still struggling to breathe. Blood soaked the earth beneath her. She had lost too much, moved too far. But there was no time to grieve, no time to rest. Only one instinct screamed louder than her pain: protect. Somehow she had to survive, for her child. The rain had come early that season, relentless and cold, turning the forest floor into a treacherous web of mud and shadow. Vines hung like traps from above, and every sudden rustle in the underbrush could be a threat. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. With her newborn clinging to her chest, barely strong enough to hold on, the mother gorilla pressed forward through the downpour, her body aching from the strain of birth, her breath short and ragged. Yet every step was a promise. I will not lose you. They hadn't even had time to rest. The troop had scattered after the storm uprooted their shelter, and with it came the scent of predators, leopards, hyenas, things that didn't care that she was weak or that her baby hadn't even opened his eyes fully. She had no help now, no silverback to protect her, no sisters to watch over her child. Just her and the tiny heartbeat against her chest. That was all, and it had to be enough. She found a ridge, barely more than a crack in the earth, but it offered a brief reprieve from the wind. She crouched low, curling around the infant with what little strength she had left, shielding him from the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her arms trembled, not from fear, but from the effort of staying still, staying warm, staying quiet. She listened. Every twig that snapped in the distance made her heart race. But she didn't move, not until the dark faded to gray. And even then, only because her baby stirred, his tiny hand clutching a tuft of her fur, as if to say, I'm still here. The days blurred together. Hunger clawed at her belly, but she wouldn't leave him. Not even for a second. She foraged only what she could reach without letting him go. Bark, leaves, bitter roots. Anything to keep the milk flowing. Her body had become a vessel of survival, no longer hers but his. And when the howls echoed in the night, when the scent of something cruel filled the wind, she didn't run. She stood still, massive, silent, unmoving, her back to the threat, her arms a fortress around her baby. She had nothing left to fight with but her will. But sometimes, that's the only weapon that matters. Not teeth, not claws, not strength, but the unwavering will to protect something smaller than yourself. The jungle had many rules, most of them written in blood, in fear, in what you could overpower or outrun. But she rewrote them with each step. Limping, breathing ragged, her arms cradling her newborn against her chest as vines tore at her fur and distant roars warned her to stop. She didn't, because love doesn't stop. It doesn't ask if it's strong enough. It just goes. She found a hollow under the roots of a fallen tree, a place just wide enough for her body, just safe enough for one night. The baby whimpered, and her hand trembled as it brushed over his fragile head. The storm still raged above, a deafening symphony of chaos. But inside that hollow, she created silence, shelter, a new beginning. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her wounds had reopened, but her heartbeat, slow, steady, deliberate, kept time with his. She was still here, and so was he. The night dragged on like a trial, each hour a new test. A snake slithered near the entrance. She didn't flinch. A distant screech signaled the return of the silverbacks who had once driven her away. She stayed still, holding her breath, her eyes wide in the dark. She would not be chased again, not tonight. Not when everything she had left was curled into the space between her arms. And just before dawn, something extraordinary happened. The baby lifted his head, only for a second, only an inch. But it was enough. Enough to tell her that he was strong, that her suffering had not been in vain, that the legacy of her courage would live inside him, not through words, not through stories, but through survival, through the choice to continue, through the love that held through the night when nothing else did. That morning she stepped into the light again, not healed, not whole, but unbroken. And that alone was enough to terrify everything that had once hunted her, because fear was no longer hers to hold. It had passed like a torch into the hearts of those who dared threaten her baby. In the tangled jungle, soaked by relentless rain and echoing with distant cries, the mother gorilla stood where no one expected her to rise. Her legs trembled, her breath came in ragged bursts, but her eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, burned with something ancient. Not rage, not despair, but an oath, silent, unshakable, written in the marrow of every mother who had once watched the world try to take her child. She moved through the undergrowth like a shadow wrapped in muscle, one arm wrapped tightly around her trembling newborn. The baby let out the softest cry, more whimper than wail, but it lit a fire in her chest strong enough to split stone. Her body bore fresh wounds from the escape, slashes from bramble thickets, bruises from where she'd fallen during the labor. And still she kept moving, because what lay behind them was worse than pain. It was silence, the silence of the troop she had lost, the silence of the male silverback who hadn't stayed, the silence of the forest that had once offered her safety but now whispered betrayal from every tree. Every branch she broke as she passed became a promise. I'm still here, and I am not done. Days passed like this, an ache stretched over time. No food, little rest. She scavenged what she could, wild ginger roots, softened bark, dew collected on broad leaves. She chewed and regurgitated each bite to feed her calf, despite the hollowness in her own belly. Predators circled. A leopard once stepped too close, eyes narrowing as it sniffed the bleeding air. But one glance at her posture, the squared shoulders, the low guttural warning in her throat, and it backed into the brush. She had become something untouchable, not because she was strongest, but because she was chosen. Chosen by a baby who reached for her, trusted her warmth, cried only when her heartbeat wasn't near. And so she stayed, through storms that stripped trees bare, through nights so cold her breath fogged the air, like ghosts leaving her lungs, through days when she thought she could not take another step. But she did, because he needed her, and that need was stronger than exhaustion, heavier than pain, louder than doubt. She carried not just a child, but the very idea of survival, of love made visible, of hope in fur and flesh. When her legs finally gave out beneath her and she collapsed beside a tree root, she didn't cry. She just curled herself around the baby, shielding him with her entire body. Her arms, though weak, stayed firm. Her heart, though weary, beat steady. And the child, he slept, safe, tucked beneath the fiercest thing the forest had ever known. A mother who would rather stop breathing than let him cry alone. That night the jungle quieted. Even the wind softened. The moon slipped between branches and painted them in silver. And somewhere deep in the dark, the howls of those who once hunted her fell silent. Because they knew she had made it this far, and that meant she would make it farther. She didn't need a troop, or a mate, or a sanctuary built by human hands. She had what she needed, right there in her arms. And when her child opened his eyes and blinked at the world for the first time in light, not fear, it was her reflection he saw. And in that reflection was everything the world had tried to erase. Strength without violence, tenderness without weakness, a quiet that roared louder than any threat. She had no crown, no territory, no allies, but she had him. And that made her sovereign over something far greater than a jungle. It made her queen of the moment, ruler of the choice to protect, to nurture, to stay. Each breath she took became a contract with the future. You will live, even if I don't. She rose with the sunrise, shaky but unbroken. Her baby clung to her chest, tiny hands tangled in the fur above her heart. He didn't cry, he didn't flinch, because he knew that sound, he knew that rhythm, And when the day brought more trials, broken terrain, sharp rocks, sudden river crossings, she navigated them not with ease, but with a kind of holy determination. Her steps weren't fast, but they were sacred, measured. Each one said, "Still here, still yours." They found a clearing days later, sheltered by banyan trees and surrounded by wild plantain. She made a nest from her own fur, from fallen leaves and bent branches, and laid him gently in its center. She didn't rest. She stood over him, a sentinel in silence. Her eyes scanned every movement. Her ears flicked at every sound. No predator approached, not because they weren't hungry, but because something about her posture told them, "Try it, and I will teach you the meaning of loss." And yet she wasn't just fighting, she was healing. In the moments between panic and exhaustion, something ancient stirred within her, the memory of being held once by her own mother, a warmth she hadn't felt in years, the way that same heartbeat had once kept her alive. She had forgotten, but now it returned, not in memory, but in motion. She moved like her mother had once moved. She grunted the same soft lullabies. She protected as she had been protected, and in doing so, she wasn't just saving her child, she was becoming whole again. That's what no one told her, that in the act of giving everything, sometimes the pieces you thought were lost come home, not with a parade, not with fanfare, but in the gaze of a newborn looking at you like you are the only truth that exists. The baby grew stronger by the hour. His limbs stretched. His eyes stayed open longer. He began to mimic her gestures, clumsy but sure. And each time he gripped her finger or nestled into her chest, she felt it. Something rebuilding, something returning. The jungle hadn't given her much, but it had given her this, and that was enough. When they were found by the small team of wildlife rescuers, drawn in by her tracks, alerted by nearby villagers who had seen her silhouette near the hills, she didn't attack. She didn't flee. She didn't beg. She just placed her body between her baby and the humans, eyes locked, not with fear, but with command. "If you mean harm," her stare said, "you will not survive me." But they didn't come with ropes, or cages, or needles. They came with whispers, with lowered eyes, with bananas and water, extended palms and patience. And when one of them, an older man with soft hands, sat cross-legged and simply waited, the gorilla watched. Her baby looked too. And when he reached out, not toward the man, but toward the stillness he brought, she didn't pull him back. She let him reach, because she had learned something too. That not all who come close are dangerous, that some things can be earned. The next day, she allowed the humans to come nearer. They made no sudden moves. They didn't try to touch, but they built a perimeter of trust around her, a sanctuary of stillness. And in that space, something grew. Not captivity, not ownership, but partnership. She was never caged, never forced. When she finally allowed them to walk beside her, it wasn't because she was tamed. It was because she had chosen. Chosen for her son, for herself, for the future they both deserved. One built not on what was taken, but on what was left behind and still chose to grow. She had lost nearly everything, her mate, her troop, her territory, but not her spirit, not her will. And standing beside that tiny heartbeat she had risked everything for, she realized the jungle had miscalculated, because it thought it could break her by stripping her of what she loved most. But all it did was reveal the lengths she would go to for love. And in that revelation, something ancient was reawakened. Not just instinct, but lineage. The memory of generations of mothers who had stood their ground in the face of fire, flood, and fang. She was not the first to carry her child across this scorched soil. Not the first to outrun the unspeakable, but perhaps she was the first to do it under the eyes of the world, with cameras rolling, with the silence of humanity finally listening instead of hunting. She didn't know their language, but she spoke the oldest truth there is: protect what matters, no matter the cost. And as her son took his first steps without her support, wobbly, wide-eyed, but bold, something inside her finally exhaled. For days she had held her breath, waiting for the world to take from her again. But it hadn't, not this time. And maybe that's what healing looks like for a gorilla. Not safety, not certainty, but space. Space to hope. Space to let down her guard, even if just for a moment. Space to remember what softness feels like after so much steel. That night, as they lay beneath the canopy, moonlight threading through the leaves like silver breath, the baby curled into her side and let out a sound. Not of hunger, not of fear, but of contentment. A low, barely audible hum that matched the rhythm of her chest. And in that moment, everything slowed. The world, the memories, the scars. Nothing else mattered. Not what they had lost, not what they feared. Just this, skin to skin, breath to breath, love to love, an unbroken promise in the dark. And far off, just beyond the reach of her senses, other gorillas stirred. A distant call echoed through the trees, one she hadn't heard in weeks. A member of her old troop, or another searching mother? She didn't know, but she listened. And for the first time since the birth, she didn't tense. She just listened, because the jungle hadn't silenced her after all. It had only forced her to find her voice. The rescuers stayed a respectful distance, documenting, waiting, learning from her instead of trying to teach. They took notes not on what she lacked, but what she embodied. And slowly, a plan formed. A sanctuary not just for her and her baby, but for others like them. For mothers who had been chased from their homes. For infants who had lost everything but the will to hold on. And she would be the first resident, the first matriarch, the beginning of a new legacy. She had no idea what that meant. Only that tomorrow was coming, and that for the first time in a long time, she didn't dread its arrival. She welcomed it. She would face it, with her child by her side in the jungle not as a threat, but as something to rebuild. Not in defiance of the past, but in honor of it, of the cries that went unanswered, of the mothers who ran but didn't make it, of the babies who reached for arms that never came. She carried them all now, in her breath, in her stride, in the quiet, deliberate way she shielded her child from even the falling leaves. There was no room left for fear, only memory. Memory that shaped every instinct, every glance, every decision. Because survival for her was never just about staying alive. It was about carrying the story forward, so that no one would ever again forget what love looked like in its fiercest, most fragile form. And love had made her powerful, not in the way humans understood power, with noise and control, but in the silence of her stillness, in the way she stood between her child and the unknown, in the way her eyes, dark and bottomless, held the depth of every choice she had made to stay, and in the way her son, despite the hunger and exhaustion and terror of his earliest days, began to thrive. Because she had stayed, because she hadn't given in. The forest too began to shift. The sounds of gunfire were replaced by the rustle of caretakers' boots, the quiet hum of drones used to monitor, not to kill. There were still threats, always would be. But here, in this corner carved out by courage, something new was growing. A new kind of wild. One watched over, not controlled. One respected, not owned. And she was the center of it. The story everyone whispered about. The mother who had refused to run. The one who, when everything around her burned, stood still and held her baby closer. And her baby was learning too. Learning the scent of safety, the shape of peace. He no longer startled at every breeze, no longer cried out in the night. He slept now, deeply, trusting that the world outside his mother's arms would not hurt him. That was the greatest miracle of all. Not that he had survived, but that he was starting to believe he could belong. And as the sun rose over the treetops one morning, catching in the damp curve of her back, painting golden light across her child's sleeping face, she watched the jungle breathe again. Birds called, leaves whispered, and deep in the soil, beneath her heavy feet, the roots of new beginnings stretched quietly forward. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew this. She was no longer just surviving, she was becoming. Not what she had been before, not a return to who she was, but something entirely new. A mother shaped by the fire, a matriarch born not in bloodline but in sacrifice, And her child, the symbol of that courage, would never have to question if he was worth it. He would know, because she had made sure of it. Every day, every breath, every choice. She didn't need a monument. Her legacy was living, breathing, growing. And that was more than enough, because not every legacy is carved in stone or etched in stories passed down by voices. Some are written in the way a child breathes safely in their sleep, in the way a mother's back curves protectively before danger ever arrives, in the way the wind shifts ever so slightly when a presence like hers walks through the jungle, calm, certain, unwavering. The other animals knew her, not because she demanded recognition, but because she embodied something ancient, a presence, a force that told them without words, this is what it means to endure, to keep walking when your legs shake, to keep shielding when your heart breaks, to keep loving when everything in you wants to retreat. She had nothing left to prove, only something to protect, and that became her purpose. Not revenge, not justice, but peace. One tree, one morning, one breath at a time. And her son? He began to move with her rhythm. He stopped hiding behind her legs. He started stepping into the light first, drinking from the stream without glancing over his shoulder. Smiling, if gorillas could smile, in the soft curve of his eyes and the relaxed drop of his shoulders. He was not just alive, he was healing. And every moment of that healing traced itself back to her decision, to not run, to not hide, to not give in. They watched the sunrise together now, not as fugitives, but as witnesses, as survivors, as builders of something no one believed could exist again. Trust. It was slow, it was silent, but it was real. One quiet step into a future made not of revenge, but of remembrance. She hadn't forgotten what had been taken. She never would, but she refused to let that be the end of the story. Because now every leaf that caught the sun above her head was part of a canopy she had helped save. Every breeze that cooled her child's face was part of a world she had protected. And every night that came without the sound of gunshots was a night she had earned with nothing but her body and her will. Not every hero has a roar. Some save the world by simply not giving up on it, not demanding it be perfect, not insisting it repay them, but showing up anyway. Even after loss, even after blood, even after the world has shown you its worst. She woke up each morning not expecting gratitude, but choosing presence, choosing to breathe for the both of them, to stand even when her body still ached from the night he was born. Her spine bore the history of every battle, every chase, every scream that had once echoed through the jungle. But her heart, it bore the map of what could be, if she just kept going. And her son, barely taller than her knee, didn't know all she had given. He didn't know about the night she'd stayed awake, crouched and trembling, as men passed just meters away. He didn't know how close they had come to never making it at all. But he knew her rhythm. He knew the beat of her chest, steady and strong, even when storms cracked the sky above them. He knew that when he stumbled, her hand would always find his shoulder, that when he cried, it was okay to cry louder, that when he laughed, it was safe to laugh from the belly. And isn't that what survival is? Not just breath, but belonging. Not just movement, but meaning. She had given him that, not in grand acts, but in the space between, in how she never flinched when he reached for her, in how she let him run ahead now, just a little farther, just a little freer, because love like that doesn't trap, it teaches flight. She didn't know what the next season would bring. She didn't know if danger would return or if old scars would ache when the rains came. But she knew this, they would face it together. And together was already a victory, already a miracle, already a promise written in footprints across the forest floor. The jungle knew her, not by name, but by the silence she left behind. A peace that hadn't existed before, a story that didn't end in tragedy, a life that hadn't been stolen, but rebuilt. Because some warriors carry no weapons, just hearts that refuse to shut, just arms that never stop holding, just a will that keeps whispering, not today, not this one, not while I breathe. That was her vow, not spoken aloud but etched into every step she took, every glance she cast into the shadows. It lived in the way she positioned herself between her son and the wind, in the way she scanned the treetops before she ever let him climb. She had become more than a mother. She was a shield, a teacher, a map, and a memory. And even when her muscles trembled, even when her legs begged her to rest, she pressed on. Not for survival alone, but for the possibility of joy, of peace, of watching him live a life not defined by fear. Because in him she saw everything that had once been taken from her, and she would be damned before she let the same happen to him. So she softened the world around him, one leaf at a time. She found the safest places to sleep, the ripest fruit to share, the cleanest water to drink. She taught him how to listen, not just with his ears, but with his whole body. How to read the silence, how to trust his instincts but question his fear, how to move like the forest had raised him. And in return, he gave her something she hadn't known she was still allowed to hope for: wonder, the kind of wide-eyed, open-hearted trust that no trauma could erase. He nuzzled her cheek without hesitation. He climbed her back, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And when she paused to breathe, to finally sit and watch the wind pass through the trees, he curled beside her. Not out of need, but out of love. That was the beginning of healing. Not loud, not fast, but real. And when other gorillas began to return, those scattered by fear, separated by chaos, they didn't just follow her path, they followed her example. They watched how she led, not with dominance, but with devotion. How she didn't hoard safety, but created it around her like a radius of calm. The jungle didn't just remember her strength, it was shaped by it. Trees bloomed where she had once wept. Trails grew firm where her feet had once dragged. And in every corner where silence had once screamed, there was now something softer, kinder, a promise that stayed behind long after danger passed. Because some legacies are not built in thrones or trophies. They're built in who we protect, in how we love, in what we're willing to face down, not for glory, but for each other. That was what remade the forest. Not the clash of teeth or the triumph of muscle, but the quiet decision to protect what was small, what was still learning, what hadn't yet known loss. And so she continued. Not because she had all the answers, but because she had chosen to never stop asking the right questions. What does safety look like? Where does trust begin? How do we build something soft in a world that so often feels sharp? She answered not with words, but with action. With the way she stepped aside so others could feed. With the way she waited when someone behind her slowed. With the way she offered her own back as shelter when the rains came early and hard. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic in the way stories are usually told. But it was something far stronger, enduring. It changed those around her, not with noise, but with consistency. Her son grew beneath that canopy of care. He watched not just what his mother did, but why she did it, and something powerful rooted in him. Not dominance, not fear, but gentleness, a reverence for life. He learned how to roar, yes, but he also learned when silence was louder. He understood that strength wasn't in who could push hardest, but in who could hold still longest, especially when it was hardest. And the others? They stayed too. A new kind of troop began to take shape, one built not on rank, but on rhythm, on reciprocity, on what it meant to carry each other without demand. Their presence alone became a kind of resistance against the poachers, against the panic, against the belief that love was weakness or that care was naive. Because every day they survived with kindness was a rebellion. Every bond that wasn't broken became a monument, and every soft touch between mother and child, between elder and youth, between stranger and friend, was a declaration that the world could be different, had to be. And she, this once wounded, once hunted mother, had lit that fire without ever meaning to. Simply by staying, by refusing to give up, by choosing to love not just when it was easy, but especially when it wasn't. Because some revolutions are quiet, and some queens wear scars instead of crowns. Scars that told stories no one else had the courage to speak aloud. Stories of nights spent awake, not out of fear, but from the unshakable need to protect. Stories of hunger ignored so that another could eat, of rain-soaked nights when her arms formed the only roof, of wounds never tended because tending others mattered more. And those scars didn't make her broken. They made her sovereign. She walked with a strength that didn't need to announce itself. It was in her eyes, clear, unwavering, ancient. It was in the way others moved when she entered, not out of fear, but out of reverence, because they knew. Here was someone who had faced everything meant to break her and chose, again and again, to hold the line. Her son watched, and from her he learned that pain wasn't the end of the story, that survival could be a beginning, that love wasn't a risk, it was the reason. He saw how she didn't flinch at the world anymore, how she stood still when it tried to shake her, how she stayed soft without ever becoming small. He mimicked her steps before he even knew why. Steady, rooted. He began to move like her, like the forest mattered, like every creature in it had a place. He carried her legacy not just in his blood, but in his choices, and others noticed. The younger ones followed him, not because he was the strongest, but because he had become the safest, and the wisest, and the one most likely to turn back if someone was missing. The forest, once echoing with silence and absence, began to hum again. It wasn't just that they had survived, it was that they had rebuilt. A new kind of family, one not defined by birth or dominance or tradition, but by choice, by care, by who stayed when staying meant sacrificing everything else. And at the center of it all, she remained. Older now, slower, but no less powerful. She didn't lead from the front anymore, but she didn't have to. Her presence had carved a path that others now walked with confidence. Her scars had become landmarks, and every time a new mother stepped forward with trembling arms to cradle her firstborn, she was there, watching, remembering, blessing the courage it took to begin again. Because sometimes the greatest revolution is a single life healed by love, and sometimes the one who once needed saving becomes the reason an entire world rises differently. Not louder but gentler, not harder but more aware. Because once someone had to carry the weight of survival alone, and now no one had to. The young ones learned not just from her strength, but from her softness. They saw that real power wasn't in how high you could climb or how loud you could roar, but in how tenderly you could hold what mattered, how fiercely you could protect it without turning bitter, how willingly you could forgive a world that hadn't been kind to you, simply so that kindness could have a chance to return. And the forest listened. It changed, not overnight, but moment by moment. Old predators walked wider circles around the trees where new life slept. Younger mothers raised their voices less and their arms more. Elders sat in silence beside the river, watching the past flow into the future, and realizing it no longer carried only loss. It carried possibility. The son grew tall, but more than that, he grew whole. He didn't know every detail of what his mother had faced. He only knew that her eyes held storms and stars in equal measure, and that when she looked at him, the sky itself felt closer. And so he watched over her, not as a debt, but as a choice. Not because she was weak, but because she had once been all the strength he had. And still she stayed. Not as the warrior she had once been, but as the home she had always become. Her body slower, her movements quieter, but her presence as solid as the mountains that had once echoed her cries. She didn't need to lead anymore. She had already led them somewhere better. Some nights, as the moon hung low and the world felt still, she would lie with her son beside her, his breath deep, his heart steady, and know that everything had been worth it. The pain, the fight, the hope she had clung to when there was nothing else left. Because here, in the quiet rhythm of survival reimagined, she had become something more than a mother, more than a survivor. She had become the reason a new kind of future could take root. Not because she had never fallen, but because every time she did, she rose differently. Years from now, they would speak of her, not as a myth, but as a memory that breathed. They wouldn't tell her story with fear or pity, but with reverence. Because what she did wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic in the way legends usually are. It was quieter, deeper. It was survival turned into sanctuary. It was pain turned into purpose. Her son would carry the echo of her footsteps long after hers had faded into soil. Not just in how he moved, but in how he stayed, in how he paused before anger, in how he chose softness even when strength was easier, in how he listened, not just with ears, but with presence. That was her legacy, not carved in stone, but lived in the way another life had been shaped by hers. And long after her body returned to the earth she once fought on, something of her remained in the roots, in the leaves, in the way the jungle breathed around her favorite tree, the one where she had first held her son close and whispered, without words, that he was safe now, that he would always be safe, because she had stayed. And in the stories told under starlit canopies, mothers would speak her name without needing to say it. Sons would feel her love without needing to know where it came from, because she wasn't just one gorilla. She was every mother who refused to run, every heart that chose to stay, every reason we still believe in survival that leads to something better. If this story moved you, don't just scroll. Stay, like, share, and help her legacy live on.